The digital age has gifted us with the illusion of presence. We see a face on a screen, we hear a compressed voice through a speaker, and we conclude that a person exists, that they are healthy, and that they are safe. In January 2025, this digital illusion became a weapon of deception used by a family in Farmington, Connecticut. A social worker from the Department of Children and Families, DCF, sat in a quiet office, conducting what was supposed to be a routine wellness check for 11-year-old Jacqueline, Mimi Torres-Garcia. On the other end of the video call, a young girl appeared. She was positioned carefully in the frame, her face partially obscured by the low resolution of the camera and the strategic lighting of the room. She waved. She might have even smiled. The worker, satisfied that the child was present and accounted for, checked a box on a digital form and closed the file. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. But the tragedy of Mimi Torres-Garcia is that by the time that wellness check occurred, she had already been dead for 4 months. The girl on the screen was a ghost, or rather, a living sibling forced to play the role of a sister who was currently decomposing in a plastic storage tote in the basement of the very apartment where the call was being placed. This was not just a murder. It was a year-long performance of normalcy designed to hide a torture chamber behind the facade of a suburban home. To understand how Mimi became a ghost in the machine, we have to look back at the girl she was before she entered the apartment on Unionville Avenue in Farmington. For the majority of her young life, Mimi was a vibrant, curly-haired child who knew the meaning of stability. She lived under the primary care of her paternal grandmother, a woman who describes Mimi as a child who loved to draw, a girl who found joy in the small details of school life, and someone who was deeply connected to her extended family. In those years, there were no zip ties, no corner punishments, and no starvation. There was only the typical rhythm of a childhood in Connecticut. However, the trajectory of Mimi's life shifted drastically in 2022. Due to a change in custody arrangements, she was moved into the home of her biological mother, Carla Garcia. It was a move that, on paper, seemed like a reunification. In reality, it was the beginning of an era of isolation. The apartment in Farmington was shared by Carla, her boyfriend Jonathan Nanita, and eventually, Carla's sister, Jacqueline Garcia. As the family unit solidified, Mimi's world began to shrink. The girl who once had a community of teachers, friends, and grandparents was slowly being pulled back into the shadows. The summer of 2024 served as the tactical turning point for the horrors to follow. In July of that year, Carla Garcia took a step that is now the center of a massive legislative debate in the state of Connecticut. She officially withdrew Mimi from the public school system. The reason given was homeschooling. Under current laws, parents have significant latitude to educate their children at home, often with minimal oversight. For Carla Garcia, homeschooling wasn't about curriculum or education. It was a strategic wall built to block the view of mandatory reporters. Teachers, nurses, and school counselors are trained to spot the signs of abuse. The thinning hair of malnutrition, the bruising of restraint, the hollowed-out eyes of a child in fear. By pulling Mimi from school, Carla ensured that the only people who saw Mimi were the people who were allegedly hurting her. As the 2024 school year began for other children, Mimi's life became a cycle of unimaginable cruelty. According to the arrest warrants that would eventually be unsealed, the Farmington apartment was transformed into what investigators can only describe as a torture chamber. The punishments were not occasional. They were the routine of the household. Mimi was forced to stand in a corner for hours and then days on end. She was forbidden from sitting. She was forbidden from lying down. When her 11-year-old legs could no longer support her weight, the adults in the room didn't offer a chair. They used plastic zip ties to keep her upright or restrained. The physical toll of this treatment began to manifest in ways that made it impossible for her to be seen in public. Malnutrition set in quickly. The starvation mentioned in the autopsy wasn't just a lack of food. It was a weaponized withholding of basic human needs. While the adults in the home ate while they shopped, and while they moved about their lives, Mimi was wasting away. The neighbors in the Farmington complex lived just inches away, separated only by drywall and wood. They reported hearing thumping or noise, but the screams were largely absent. It is the silence of the victim that is often the most terrifying part of these cases. A child so broken and so terrified that they no longer even cry for help. By September 2024, investigators believe Mimi's body finally gave out. The exact date of her death is a grim approximation, but the cover-up began the moment her heart stopped beating. Instead of calling emergency services, instead of a moment of remorse, the trio allegedly began a logistical operation to hide the evidence of their failure. They didn't bury her in the woods or flee the state. They placed her in a plastic storage tote, wrapped her in blankets and plastic, and moved her into the basement of the apartment building. For the next year, Carla, Jonathan, and the aunt lived a double life that defies psychological explanation. They continued to live in that apartment for months while Mimi's remains sat beneath them. They interacted with neighbors. They went to the grocery store. Most chillingly, Carla Garcia continued to engage with the state of Connecticut. She didn't just hide Mimi's death, she monetized it. She continued to collect SNAP benefits, using the government's food assistance program to buy groceries for the household using Mimi's name. Every swipe of that EBT card was a reaffirmation of the lie. The deception reached its peak during the winter months of 2024 and 2025. When DCF workers grew concerned or scheduled wellness checks, Carla was ready. She reportedly used another child in the family, a younger sibling, to stand in for Mimi. She manipulated the camera angles of the video calls to hide the child's true height and features. She coached the child on what to say and when to wave. To the state, Mimi was a success story of a homeschool child thriving in a private environment. In reality, the state was looking at a decoy, while the real Mimi was being kept in a dark basement. As the lease on the Farmington apartment began to draw to a close, the smell of decay became an obstacle that even the most dedicated liars couldn't ignore. Police reports indicate that the trio began staying in hotels to escape the odor that was permeating their living space. Yet, even as they prepared to move to a new residence in New Britain, they didn't leave the secret behind. They loaded the storage tote into a vehicle and transported Mimi's remains to their new home. It was a traveling horror show, a family moving from one city to another, carrying the evidence of a murder with them like a piece of luggage. The world would remain ignorant of Mimi's fate until October 2025, when a single tip would lead police to an abandoned house on Bloom Street. But before that discovery, there was a moment where the entire web of lies almost came crashing down. It happened on a cold night in late December, just days after Christmas, when the Farmington police arrived at the door of the apartment. The officers were responding to a simple noise complaint, a routine call they handle a dozen times a week. As the door opened, they were met by a smiling, pregnant Carla Garcia and a relaxed Jonathan Nanita. They stood on the threshold of the home, exchanging pleasantries and jokes about apartment living, completely unaware that the answer to a missing persons case and the remains of a tortured child were resting in a plastic bin just a few feet away in the basement below their boots. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. The transition from a home to a crime scene is often marked by a single, definitive act of violence. But in the case of Mimi Torres-Garcia, the crime scene was a living, breathing environment where life, and the pretense of life, continued for over a year. After Mimi's heart stopped beating in the fall of 2024, her mother, Carla Garcia, and her boyfriend, Jonathan Nanita, didn't panic and flee. Instead, they leaned into a chillingly quiet normalcy. This period, stretching from the final months of 2024 through most of 2025, represents a masterclass in psychological manipulation. While the physical evidence of their crime was hidden in a basement storage tote, the adults upstairs were engaged in a performance for the benefit of neighbors, social workers, and even the police. One of the most haunting moments of this silent year occurred on December 29, 2024. Farmington police were dispatched to the apartment on Unionville Avenue for a routine noise complaint. Neighbors, perhaps sensing the erratic tension of the household, even if they couldn't identify its source, had reported disturbances. The body cam footage from that night serves as a jarring testament to the suspect's ability to mask their reality. When the officers arrived, they didn't find a household in disarray. They were met by a calm, soft-spoken Carla Garcia. She was heavily pregnant at the time, a detail that she used as a conversational shield. She joked with the officers about her mood swings and the frustrations of living in a building with thin walls. Jonathan Nanita stood by her side, nodding in agreement, portraying the image of a supportive, tired father-to-be. The officers stayed for only a few minutes. They looked around the living area, saw nothing out of the ordinary, and recorded the names of the occupants. There was no mention of Mimi. There was no sign of a struggle. To the officers, it was just another mundane Saturday night call. But the horror lies in the geography of that interaction. As the police stood in the doorway, offering neighborly advice on how to keep the noise down, they were standing just feet above the basement where Mimi's remains were being kept. The suspects didn't just lie to the police. They invited them into the very space where the crime was still active, betting on their ability to act like a normal family. This psychopathy of the mundane is what allowed the cover-up to persist. Beyond the psychological deception, the investigation has uncovered a secondary motive for the cover-up: financial gain. For Carla Garcia and Jonathan Nanita, Mimi's death didn't mean the end of her value to the household. For nearly a year, the couple allegedly engaged in a systematic fraud against the state of Connecticut. According to the 2026 court filings, Carla continued to collect Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, benefits in Mimi's name long after the child had passed away. In January 2025, just weeks after the friendly encounter with the Farmington police, Carla submitted renewal paperwork to the Department of Social Services. She listed Mimi as a resident dependent, claiming the state's food assistance was necessary to keep her daughter fed. This detail is particularly gruesome when viewed alongside the eventual autopsy findings. While the state was depositing funds intended to provide nutrition for a growing 11-year-old girl, that girl was already gone, her body bearing the permanent marks of the very starvation the benefits were meant to prevent. Investigators estimate that the couple defrauded the state of thousands of dollars, using Mimi's identity as a source of steady income. This wasn't a crime of impulse. It was a crime of maintenance. Every form signed and every benefit card swiped was a calculated decision to keep the secret alive for the sake of the ledger. As 2025 progressed, the logistical burden of the secret began to grow. The smell of the basement is a recurring theme in the witness statements from the case. The aunt, Jacqueline Garcia, later told investigators that the odor in the Farmington apartment became so overwhelming that the family eventually stopped using certain rooms. They began a cycle of staying in local hotels, telling friends and relatives they were simply renovating or taking a break. This was the beginning of the musical chairs phase of the cover-up. The trio was constantly moving, shifting the focus of their lives away from the decaying reality in the cellar. The investigation eventually revealed that when the lease in Farmington ended in early 2025, the family relocated to a new residence in New Britain. They didn't leave the storage tote behind to be found by a landlord. With a level of callousness that investigators still find difficult to articulate, they loaded the bin, containing the remains of the child, into a vehicle and drove it to their new home. For months in New Britain, they continued the charade. They were the new family on the block, the couple with the new baby, the neighbors who seemed a bit quiet but otherwise unremarkable. The break in the case didn't come from a sophisticated forensic technique or a sudden confession. It came from the weight of the secret becoming too heavy for the suspects to carry. In October 2025, as the weather began to turn, the bin was finally moved for the last time. It was left behind an abandoned, overgrown house on Clark Street in New Britain. The suspects likely thought the vacant property would serve as a final resting place, a spot where the weeds would swallow the evidence of their year of silence. They were wrong. A witness noticed suspicious activity, a vehicle idling in the shadows, people moving a heavy object into the tall grass. It was a single, observant citizen who finally punctured the bubble of normalcy that Carla and Jonathan had spent a year inflating. When the New Britain police arrived at the vacant lot, they found the plastic container tucked away, covered with a comforter and sheets, as if someone had tried to tuck the secret into bed. Inside, they found a laundry basket, and inside that, the advanced remains of a child. The missing girl, who had never been reported missing, had finally been found. As the forensic team processed the Clark Street scene, the focus shifted from who was in the bin to how she had died. The initial look at the remains suggested a story of neglect, but as the chief medical examiner began the internal examination, they discovered a forensic marker so specific and so tragic that it would change the charges from neglect to cold-blooded murder. It was a single, tiny find in the child's stomach, a final, desperate piece of evidence that Mimi had tried to survive until her very last breath. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. When the storage tote was finally opened in the controlled, sterile environment of the Connecticut office of the chief medical examiner in late 2025, the investigators were prepared for a grim discovery. They were not, however, prepared for the physical reality of what 11-year-old Jacqueline Mimi Torres-Garcia had become. As the medical examiners began their work, the narrative of accidental death, or unfortunate neglect, spun by the family began to evaporate. The body of a child is a record of her life. In Mimi's case, it was a record of a year-long siege. The most staggering figure in the autopsy report, released in full in January 2026, was Mimi's weight. At the time of her death, this 11-year-old girl, who stood 4 feet 8 inches tall, weighed a mere 27 pounds. To hold that number in your mind is to realize the scale of the failure. 27 pounds is the average weight of a healthy 2-year-old toddler. Mimi was nearly 5 feet tall. Her skeletal structure alone should have weighed more than her total body mass. The medical examiner noted a near-total absence of subcutaneous fat and severe muscle wasting. Her body had been forced into a state of biological desperation known as autophagy, a process where the body, starved of external fuel, begins to consume its own muscle tissue and organs just to keep the heart beating for 1 more minute. This was not a quick death. This was a slow, agonizing process that would have taken weeks, if not months, of active withholding. The report explicitly describes the skeletal appearance Mimi would have had in her final days. This detail is crucial because it completely dismantles any defense of accidental starvation. It would have been impossible for any adult in that home, Carla, Jonathan, or Jacqueline, to look at Mimi and not see a child in the throes of death. They didn't just fail to feed her, they watched her disappear. The most haunting detail of the entire forensic file, a detail that has since become the symbol of this tragedy, was found during the internal examination of Mimi's stomach. Amidst the wasting and the emptiness, the medical examiner found one single solitary blueberry. That was it. In a world where her mother was collecting hundreds of dollars in food assistance, Mimi's final intake of sustenance was a single piece of fruit. For true crime investigators, this single blueberry is more than just a sad fact. It is a forensic marker of her will to live. It suggests that even in her final moments, even while restrained or tucked away in a corner, Mimi was searching for any tiny morsel of life she could find. However, the autopsy revealed that the abuse wasn't just passive. The toxicology report brought to light a much more sinister element of the torture chamber allegations. In Mimi's system, the laboratory found traces of amphetamines and antihistamines. The presence of these drugs changed the entire complexion of the case. Mimi had no medical diagnosis for ADHD, no prescription for stimulants, and no history of requiring such medication. The theory now being pursued by prosecutors is that these drugs were used as a form of chemical restraint. Amphetamines are stimulants. In a starving child, they can mask the extreme lethargy that comes with organ failure. They can keep a child awake and compliant, even when their body is screaming for rest. If Mimi was being forced to stand in a corner as a punishment, sometimes for days at a time as the warrants suggest, these stimulants may have been administered to keep her from collapsing. It was a way to extend her suffering, ensuring she remained upright and conscious for the discipline her mother and boyfriend deemed necessary. The antihistamines, conversely, were likely used to sedate her when her crying or presence became an inconvenience to the adults in the home. The forensic evidence also spoke to the physical restraints mentioned in the aunt's eventual confession. While the advanced state of decomposition made soft tissue bruising difficult to see, the investigators found evidence consistent with long-term ligatures. The zip ties weren't a one-time occurrence. They were a tool of the household. The medical examiner's report, combined with the crime scene photos of the apartment, painted a picture of a child who was treated less like a human being and more like an object to be stored, moved, and controlled. when Carla Garcia and Jonathan Nanita were brought in for questioning following the discovery of the bin. The autopsy results were used as the ultimate leverage. Carla initially tried to claim that Mimi had simply stopped eating or had a medical condition that caused her to lose weight. But when the detectives presented the 27-pound figure, when they asked her how an 11-year-old becomes the weight of a toddler without a mother noticing, the story shifted. Under the pressure of the forensic truth, Carla allegedly admitted that they had stopped giving Mimi food for roughly 2 weeks prior to her death. Jonathan Nanita's interrogation was equally revealing. He attempted to distance himself from the day-to-day parenting choices, but he couldn't explain the presence of Mimi's body in a bin he admitted to moving. He told police he saw blood all over the walls of the apartment and simply panicked. This admission of blood, coupled with the starvation and fatal child abuse ruling from the medical examiner, suggests a level of physical violence that went beyond even the withholding of food. The autopsy didn't just provide a cause of death, it provided a manner of death. The office of the chief medical examiner ruled the case a homicide. This was no longer a case of neglect or a tragedy of the system. This was a calculated, prolonged killing. The 27-pound truth stood as a silent witness that the Garcia sisters and Nanita could not silence. As the forensic evidence mounted, a new question emerged. How did the aunt fit into this? Jacqueline Garcia had lived in that home, seen the zip ties, and smelled the decay. But it wasn't until she was shown the photos of what her niece had become, the 27-pound reality, that she finally broke. Her confession would reveal the most disturbing detail yet. A secret about the wellness checks and a specific, chilling conversation that took place between the adults while Mimi was still alive, begging for help. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. Jacqueline Garcia admitted to investigators that the household had devolved into a hierarchy of cruelty where Mimi was at the very bottom. She confirmed that the corner punishments were not rare events but a daily reality. She described seeing her 11-year-old niece zip-tied to furniture to prevent her from seeking food or water. Most harrowing was her description of the psychological toll. She told police that Mimi had eventually reached a state of brokenness, where she stopped asking for food and simply stood in the corner, staring at the wall, until her body would give out. Jacqueline admitted that she, too, had witnessed Mimi soiling herself because she was forbidden from leaving her designated spot, yet no one in the home, not even her own aunt, moved to help her. The aunt's confession also shed light on the calculated nature of the DCF video calls. She revealed that the family held rehearsals for the wellness checks. They would dress a younger child in Mimi's clothing and practice where the child should stand so the camera wouldn't reveal the discrepancy in height or weight. Jacqueline's admission that she watched these rehearsals take place without calling the authorities transformed her in the eyes of the law from a witness into a participant. It was this testimony that allowed prosecutors to solidify the risk of injury to a minor and unlawful restraint charges against her, carrying a weight that reflected her complicity in the slow death of her niece. As the details of the aunt's confession and the autopsy went public in late 2025 and early 2026, the state of Connecticut was forced into a period of deep soul-searching. The public outcry was not just directed at the 3 people in the New Britain jail. It was directed at a system that had been fooled by a web camera. This outrage birthed Mimi's Law, a piece of legislation that has dominated the 2026 General Assembly. Mimi's Law is designed to close the homeschooling loophole that allowed Carla Garcia to vanish her daughter. The proposed legislation mandates that if a parent with a prior history of Department of Children and Families, DCF, involvement chooses to withdraw a child from the public school system, the state must conduct in-person wellness checks every 30 days. No more video calls. No more digital ghosts. The law also requires that these children be seen by a licensed medical professional once every quarter. The logic is simple. A doctor would have seen the 27-pound reality that a social worker through a grainy zoom lens missed. The political battle over Mimi's Law has been fierce, sparking debates about parental rights versus child safety. However, the haunting image of the single blueberry found in Mimi's stomach has become a rallying cry for advocates. The legislation has moved through committees with unprecedented speed, fueled by the 2026 revelation that DCF had received at least 3 anonymous tips regarding Mimi's health in the months before she died. Tips that were reportedly closed out after the fraudulent video calls. In the courtroom, the legal machinery is now moving toward a final resolution. As of late January 2026, Carla Garcia and Jonathan Nanita remain in custody at the York and MacDougall Walker Correctional Institutions, respectively. Their bonds remain set at $5 million each, a figure reflecting the extreme cruelty cited by the judge. The additional felony fraud charges for the SNAP benefit scheme have been bundled into the murder trial, with prosecutors arguing that the fraud proves the death was not a sudden accident but a profitable, managed event. The trial for Carla Garcia is scheduled to begin in the spring of 2026. Her defense team has hinted at a strategy involving diminished capacity and coercion by Nanita, but the aunt's confession directly contradicts the idea that Carla was a passive participant. Jonathan Nanita, meanwhile, continues to maintain that he was only an accessory after the fact, a clean-up man for a crime he didn't commit. However, the presence of the amphetamines in Mimi's system, drugs that Nanita allegedly had access to, links him directly to the period of torture preceding the death. Jacqueline Garcia, the aunt, is currently negotiating a plea deal. In exchange for her full testimony against her sister and Nanita, she may see a reduction in her sentencing for the cruelty charges. For Mimi's paternal family, the Delgados, this legal maneuvering is a bitter pill to swallow. They have become the voice for Mimi in the halls of the New Britain Superior Court, wearing purple ribbons, Mimi's favorite color, to every hearing. They don't want plea deals. They want a full accounting of every minute Mimi spent in that corner. The legacy of Jacqueline Mimi Torres-Garcia is no longer just a competitor video in the true crime niche. It has become a landmark case in American child welfare. Her story has exposed the terrifying ease with which a child can be erased when the people who are supposed to protect her become her jailers. The storage tote behind the abandoned house on Bloom Street was meant to be the end of her story, a place where she would be forgotten. Instead, it became the starting point for a movement. As 2026 progresses, the state of Connecticut is preparing to pass Mimi's law, ensuring that homeschooling can never again be used as a shroud for a torture chamber. The empty apartment in Farmington has been cleaned, and new tenants walk the floors where Mimi once stood in a corner, but the echoes of her case remain. They remain in the autopsy reports that doctors will study for years. They remain in the legislative halls where new protections are being signed into law, and they remain in the hearts of a community that promised Mimi she would never be a ghost again. The truth, as it turns out, weighed 27 pounds. It was found in a single blueberry and a year of silence. And while the trial will eventually end and the prison doors will close on Carla, Jonathan, and Jacqueline, the real victory lies in the fact that because of Mimi, the next child trapped behind a screen might actually be seen. And as always, you've been watching True Crime Story Vault, where every story is told with facts, empathy, and respect for those who can no longer speak for themselves. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button and comment your thoughts below. Until next time, remember, the truth is never buried.